In the glitzy world of Hollywood, where careers are made and broken overnight, one man was supposed to disappear forever. They humiliated him. They blacklisted him. They made sure he would never set foot on a film set again. But they forgot one thing. Ethan Cole wasn't done. Ethan was once just another struggling actor, but unlike many, he faced something far worse than rejection: outright erasure. Not because he lacked talent, not because he didn't deserve a chance, but because of the color of his skin. Hollywood had its rules. There were people who got to be leading men, and there were those who were only allowed to exist in the background. And when Ethan dared to dream beyond the limits they set for him, they laughed in his face. At the center of it all, Jonathan Caldwell, a man who had built careers, destroyed reputations, and controlled the industry like a puppet master. A director so powerful, his word alone could determine whether someone became a star or vanished into obscurity. And when Ethan walked into his audition that day, Caldwell decided he didn't belong. What followed was more than rejection. It was a public execution. Ethan was humiliated, mocked, and then discarded. His name became a joke, his face a meme. Hollywood closed its doors, and Caldwell made sure they stayed shut. No casting calls, no roles, no second chances. The message was clear: you don't belong here. But what Caldwell didn't know was that he had just created his own downfall. Because Ethan wouldn't stay silent. He wouldn't stay invisible. And when he came back stronger than anyone ever imagined. This is the story of how the most powerful man in Hollywood tried to erase an actor, only to watch that actor rise higher than he ever dreamed. Before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? And don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more gripping stories, and comment below. Do you think Hollywood has really changed? Or are these stories still happening today? Ethan Cole adjusted his tie, smoothing out the wrinkles in his cheap but presentable button-up. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of anticipation pressing down on him. This was it. This was his chance. The audition for Kingdom's Fall was one of the biggest casting calls of the year, and he had spent weeks preparing. He knew the lines, understood the character, and had poured himself into every word of the script. He wasn't just going to act, he was going to become the role. He stepped into the waiting room, where dozens of actors sat, some scrolling through their phones, others murmuring lines under their breath. Most of them were white. He ignored the glances, the subtle shifts in body language that told him he was being sized up, dismissed before he even opened his mouth. Ethan had dealt with this his whole life. He had learned to pretend not to notice. A woman with a headset and clipboard called his name, her expression unreadable. Ethan Cole. He stood up, exhaling slowly, forcing himself to steady his nerves. Here. She led him down a narrow hallway toward the audition room. As they reached the door, she turned slightly, as if about to say something, but then changed her mind and simply gestured for him to enter. Ethan stepped inside. The room was large and well lit, the air crisp with the scent of expensive cologne and fresh coffee. At the far end, seated behind a long table, was Jonathan Caldwell, the legendary director himself. His name alone could make or break an actor's career. Beside him sat two casting assistants and a producer. Ethan barely had time to introduce himself before Caldwell sighed loudly, rubbing his temples as if the mere sight of him was exhausting. "Stop," Caldwell said, lifting a hand. Ethan froze, confused. He hadn't even spoken yet. The director turned to his assistant, completely ignoring Ethan. "Who let him in?" The assistant, a nervous-looking young woman, glanced at her clipboard, hesitating. "He's on the list, sir. He has a scheduled. I don't care what's on the list," Caldwell snapped, his voice sharp and final. His cold blue eyes finally landed on Ethan, scanning him like he was a stain on an otherwise spotless floor. "I don't need to see this one. It's a waste of time." Ethan's stomach twisted. He felt his face burn with humiliation, but he forced himself to keep his voice steady. "With all due respect, sir, I'd like the chance to read." Caldwell chuckled, shaking his head in amusement. He leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the table. "You'd like the chance? That's cute." One of the assistants coughed awkwardly. The producer smirked, clearly entertained. "I know exactly what I need for this role," Caldwell continued, still speaking about Ethan like he wasn't standing right in front of him. "And this isn't it." He gestured vaguely in Ethan's direction. Ethan clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He knew what Caldwell meant. He wasn't tall enough? No, plenty of leading men weren't tall. He wasn't handsome enough? No, he had seen actors less attractive land major roles. The difference? He already knew. "I can play this part," Ethan said, trying one last time. Caldwell scoffed. "Let me paint you a picture, kid." He leaned forward, his smile patronizing. "Imagine this film hitting theaters worldwide. Epic battle scenes, a gripping love story, a noble hero rising from nothing to save the kingdom. And then there's you." The room burst into laughter. Caldwell continued, undeterred. "You really think audiences want to see you in this role? Be honest." Ethan stood frozen. He knew if he walked out now, they would say he was weak. If he fought back, they would say he was difficult. Caldwell sighed dramatically, glancing at the assistant. "Why is he still here? Do I need to spell it out?" The woman hesitated. Ethan could see the discomfort in her eyes, but she didn't argue. She gestured toward the door. "I'll show myself out," Ethan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned on his heel, pushing the door open. As he stepped into the hallway, he heard Caldwell's voice behind him. "Jesus, they're getting desperate these days." More laughter. Ethan didn't stop walking. He forced his legs to move, forced his breath to remain steady. But as he reached the parking lot, he clenched his jaw so tightly it ached. He had expected rejection. He had expected bias. But this was humiliation. Ethan barely slept that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the words from his failed audition still ringing in his head. "You really think audiences want to see you?" It played on a loop, the laughter, the sneers, the way Caldwell dismissed him like he was nothing. He had walked out of that building with his head high, but now, in the silence of his tiny apartment, reality crashed down. He wasn't just rejected, he was humiliated. But he told himself it was one audition, one director. There were others. He just had to move on. The next morning, he forced himself to check his emails, looking for new casting calls, new chances. His phone buzzed. A message from Tyler McKay, another struggling actor he'd met in a few auditions. No words, just a link. Ethan hesitated, then clicked. His stomach dropped. It was a video. His video. Someone had recorded his audition. The whole brutal exchange. The laughter. Caldwell's sneering voice. The moment Ethan stood there, silent, knowing he had already lost. The headline read, "Wannabe actor gets humiliated by Jonathan Caldwell in brutal audition clip." Thousands of views. Thousands of comments. He scrolled through them, his hands cold. Dude really thought he had a shot? LMAO. Caldwell just said what we were all thinking. At least he didn't cry. I'll give him that. Ethan slammed his laptop shut. He felt like he was suffocating. It wasn't just rejection anymore. He was a joke. Over the next few days, the video spread. It wasn't just on social media. People in the industry saw it too. Every time he walked into a room, he saw it in their faces. The recognition, the amusement, the pity. But he refused to let it stop him. He kept sending out auditions, kept trying. Finally, a callback. A supporting role in a crime drama. Not a lead, but a chance. He walked into the audition room with his head up, determined to prove he was more than that video. The moment he introduced himself, he saw it. They had already made up their minds. Harrison Blythe, the director, barely looked at him. The casting agent smiled politely, but there was something forced in it. Ethan delivered his lines perfectly, every emotion sharp, every word hitting exactly where it needed to. Silence. Blythe sighed and leaned forward. "You're good, kid. Real good." Ethan's chest tightened. Maybe, just maybe, but the word hit like a slap. Blythe exchanged a glance with the casting agent. "Look, I won't sugarcoat it. You got talent. But, you come with some baggage now." Ethan's jaw clenched. Baggage. Blythe shrugged. "Caldwell really did a number on you. And this industry? It's about perception. Nobody wants to be the guy that picks up a joke. Ethan felt his pulse hammering. He tried to keep his voice steady. "I'm not a joke." Blythe nodded, almost like he agreed. "I know, but that's not what people see." He sighed again, like this was painful for him too. "It's not personal. It's just business." Ethan walked out without another word. Outside, he checked his phone. Ethan's bank account was down to its last few dollars. His rent was overdue. Auditions had dried up completely. No one wanted to hire him. Not because he wasn't good, but because he had become that guy. He sent out hundreds of emails, left messages with every casting agent he could think of, but the responses, when they came, were all the same. "We're going in a different direction." Best of luck. They weren't going in a different direction. They just didn't want to touch him. The humiliation from the Caldwell video still lingered like a stain on his name, a permanent reminder that he had been publicly rejected by one of the most powerful men in Hollywood. It was an unspoken rule. No one wanted to be associated with a failure. Desperation forced him into jobs he never imagined himself doing. First, working night shifts at a warehouse, hauling crates until his back ached. Then cleaning floors at a production studio, forced to watch actors rehearse on the same stages he once dreamed of performing on. But even that didn't pay enough. When he finally landed a job as a waiter at an upscale restaurant in Beverly Hills, he told himself it was temporary. Just until he could find another way back in. Just until someone finally gave him a chance. The restaurant catered to Hollywood's elite, producers, executives, A-list actors. Ethan kept his head down, taking orders, serving drinks, avoiding eye contact when he recognized someone from the industry. But they recognized him. The first time it happened, a pair of young actresses whispered as he refilled their glasses. One of them giggled, glancing at him over the rim of her champagne flute. "Is that him?" she murmured. "The one from the Caldwell video?" Her friend smirked. "No way. That's definitely him. Guess he took the whole audience doesn't want to see you thing seriously." They laughed. Ethan clenched his jaw, forced himself to walk away. The second time, it was worse. A group of producers sat at a corner booth, sipping whiskey and talking loudly about upcoming projects. One of them spotted Ethan and called out, grinning, "Hey, you're the guy from that viral clip, aren't you?" Ethan stiffened. "Can I get you something, sir?" The man chuckled. "Yeah, how about a career?" The table erupted in laughter. Ethan didn't flinch. He had mastered the art of swallowing his pride. He took their orders, nodded politely, and walked back to the kitchen, where he finally let out a slow, shaky breath. Then, one evening, Jonathan Caldwell himself walked in. Ethan felt his stomach drop as soon as he saw him. Caldwell strolled in like he owned the place, because in a way he did. He was surrounded by a group of actors, the cast of Kingdom's Fall. They were celebrating. The film had just hit theaters and was already being hailed as a masterpiece. Awards buzz was everywhere. Ethan lowered his head, hoping Caldwell wouldn't notice him. He moved to the bar, grabbing a bottle of expensive wine for another table. But the moment he turned around, Caldwell's voice rang out, loud and amused. "Holy sh**T, look who it is." Silence fell over the group. Every eye turned to Ethan. He forced himself to stay calm, to keep moving. But Caldwell leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Come on, don't be rude. Say hi." One of the actors, Brandon Hale, the man who had landed the role Ethan once dreamed of, grinned. "Man, you really fell off, huh?" Ethan ignored them. He focused on pouring a glass of wine for another customer, his hand steady even though his pulse was racing. Caldwell wasn't done. "Well, at least he finally found a role he's good at," he said, picking up a menu. "What do you recommend, waiter?" Laughter rippled through the group. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. He turned, meeting Caldwell's eyes, refusing to let him see how much it hurt. "Would you like red or white, sir?" Caldwell chuckled. "Red. Expensive. Make sure you don't spill it, yeah?" Ethan nodded, grabbed the bottle, and poured. His hand was steady, his face unreadable. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. But someone else made sure the humiliation was complete. As Ethan set the bottle down, Brandon Hale accidentally knocked over his glass. The deep red liquid splattered across Ethan's white shirt. soaking into the fabric. The table gasped in mock horror. "Oh shit," Brandon said, grinning. "Sorry, man. Total accident." Ethan felt the warmth of the wine seeping into his skin, smelled the bitter alcohol clinging to him. Caldwell smirked. "Well, look at the bright side, kid. At least now you're wearing something expensive." The entire table laughed. The restaurant was full of people, but no one stepped in. No one defended him. He stood there, stained and humiliated, while they continued their dinner. He wanted to scream. He wanted to throw the glass in Caldwell's smug face. But he didn't, because he knew how the story would go. Ethan sat in his car outside the restaurant, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his fingers ached. The smell of wine still clung to his shirt, seeping into his skin like a reminder that no matter how much he tried to move forward, they wouldn't let him. Jonathan Caldwell had made sure of that. That night wasn't just humiliation. It was a message. You don't belong here, and we'll make sure you never do. Ethan had thought rejection was painful, but being erased was worse. The next morning, he woke up to an email. His heart leaped when he saw the sender's name, Adam Sterling, an independent filmmaker known for giving fresh talent a chance. Ethan had sent in a tape months ago and assumed he'd been ignored like every other time. But now, Adam was offering him a role. It wasn't huge, just a supporting character in a mid-budget crime thriller. But after everything, it felt like salvation. He barely read the contract before replying. "I'd love to be part of this. When can we start?" For the first time in a long time, hope flickered back to life. Maybe Caldwell didn't own Hollywood as much as he thought. Maybe talent did still matter. Ethan threw himself into preparation, rehearsing alone in his tiny apartment, going over every scene in his head until he knew it better than his own reflection. He kept his expectations low. He knew this wasn't some grand comeback, but it was a step forward, a chance to rebuild. Then, 3 days before shooting began, he got another email. "Ethan, I'm really sorry, but we had to make a change to the cast. We're moving in a different direction. I appreciate your time. Best of luck with everything." The words blurred on the screen. He read them again, and again, and again. He called Adam, barely able to keep his voice steady. No answer. He tried again. Straight to voicemail. He sent an email, keeping it professional, asking if there had been an issue. No response. The next morning, he saw a casting announcement. The role he had been given was now going to Austin Maddox, a lesser-known but white actor with half his talent. Ethan already knew the answer, but he needed to hear it. He went to the production office, waited outside for hours until Adam finally emerged, avoiding his gaze. "I just want to know why," Ethan said, blocking his path. Adam sighed, looking around as if hoping someone would interrupt. "Ethan, man, I didn't have a choice." Ethan's chest tightened. "What do you mean, you didn't have a choice?" The hesitation told him everything. Adam exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Look, someone high up made a call. They didn't want you in the film." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. "Who?" Adam hesitated again, then finally muttered, "Caldwell." Rage surged through him so fast it made his vision blur. "Caldwell? He doesn't have anything to do with your film." Adam looked genuinely apologetic. "He doesn't have to. He just said something. That's all it takes. And I can't afford to piss off the wrong people, Ethan. I have to think about my career too." Ethan wanted to scream. He wanted to demand why his career didn't matter, why everyone else got to move forward while he was stuck in this endless spiral of rejection and humiliation. But what was the point? The decision had already been made. The industry had rules, unspoken but absolute. And one of them was simple. If Jonathan Caldwell didn't want you in Hollywood, you didn't get to be in Hollywood. That was the last audition Ethan ever went to. He stopped trying. He stopped fighting. His savings ran out. Rent was due. He had no options left. And that was how Ethan Cole became a janitor at a movie studio, sweeping the floors of the same stages he once dreamed of performing on. The first few days were a blur of humiliation and exhaustion. He wore a gray jumpsuit with the studio's logo embroidered on the chest, pushing a mop across floors that had been graced by the biggest names in Hollywood. He emptied trash cans in dressing rooms where A-list actors sat under bright vanity lights. He scrubbed toilets used by people who wouldn't even look him in the eye if they passed him on the street. But worst of all, he was invisible. Nobody recognized him now. Or worse, they did, and they just didn't care. One afternoon, as he was mopping a corridor near a soundstage, he overheard a conversation. Two actors stood nearby, laughing about some industry gossip. "Dude, remember that guy from the Caldwell video? The wannabe actor." "Yeah, the one who thought he could be a leading man. What happened to him?" "No clue. Probably flipping burgers somewhere." Ethan didn't react. He just kept mopping. Later that evening, he walked past a rehearsal. Through the open doors, he saw Brandon Hale, the same actor who had taken his dream role, running lines with a director. The urge to walk away was immediate, but something kept him there just for a second too long. Brandon noticed him. His eyes flicked over the gray jumpsuit, the mop in Ethan's hands. A slow, smug smile spread across his face. "Damn," he said loudly. "Guess Caldwell really called it, huh?" The director chuckled. Ethan turned away before he could hear the rest. That night, he sat alone in his apartment, staring at the ceiling. He had lost everything, not just his career, but his dignity, his identity. He wasn't Ethan Cole, the actor. He was Ethan Cole, the janitor. The back seat had become his bed, a tattered blanket, his only shield against the cold. He had nowhere else to go. The eviction notice had come 2 weeks ago, a final, unavoidable consequence of his downfall. His landlord hadn't even been cruel about it, just businesslike, almost apologetic. "Look, Ethan, I gave you extra time, but I can't let you stay here for free. I have other tenants." That was the thing about failure. At first, people pitied you. Then, they got tired of you. With no money left and no job prospects, his days blurred together into a monotonous cycle of scraping by. The janitor job at the studio had been humiliating, but it had paid enough to keep him afloat. Now even that was gone. He had been let go without explanation. Maybe someone had recognized him, whispered something about the Caldwell incident, and the studio decided he wasn't worth the risk. Or maybe they just saw what everyone else did, a man who had already lost. His next job was worse. A graveyard shift at a factory, stacking boxes until his arms ached. Then, when that fell through, another gig, mopping floors at a casino, dodging drunken gamblers who didn't even see him as a person. Every time he thought he had hit rock bottom, the floor crumbled beneath him, sending him lower. The worst part? Nobody cared. Hollywood had already moved on. Kingdom's Fall had won multiple awards, its cast praised as the future of cinema. Brandon Hale had become a household name, celebrated as the next big action star. And Jonathan Caldwell? He was untouchable, directing yet another major film, hailed as a visionary. Meanwhile, Ethan Cole no longer existed. One night, as he cleaned the back rooms of a bar, he heard a familiar voice from the other side of the wall. His hands froze on the mop handle. "Yeah, man, remember that guy? The one from the Caldwell video." A laugh. "Holy sh*T, yeah. What was his name again?" "I don't even know. But damn, that was brutal." He thought he was somebody. Ethan stared at the floor, the damp mop water reflecting the flickering neon sign outside. His grip tightened, but he forced himself to keep working. They didn't even remember his name. A week later, he found himself at a gas station convenience store, counting change to buy a cup of instant noodles. As he turned to leave, he nearly ran into Brandon Hale. Brandon, dressed in designer sweatpants and a hoodie worth more than Ethan's car, blinked in surprise, then grinned. "No King way," he said, laughing under his breath. "Damn, man. You still in town?" Ethan didn't answer. He just stepped aside, gripping the cup noodles a little tighter. Brandon smirked, shaking his head. "Guess Caldwell was right about you." He didn't wait for a response, just walked past him, still chuckling as he disappeared into the night. Ethan stood there, staring at his own reflection in the store's dirty glass door. His own face looked unfamiliar, hollow, tired, beaten. "Caldwell was right about you." The words rang in his head long after Brandon was gone. That night, he sat in his car, the cup of noodles untouched in the passenger seat. He turned on his phone, staring at the screen for a long time. His fingers hovered over social media, over old messages, over contacts he hadn't spoken to in years. But there was nothing left to say. His career was over. His dignity had been stripped away piece by piece. No one was coming to save him. He was completely, utterly alone. The next morning, he went to a public library, using their free Wi-Fi to check his email. Nothing. No callbacks. No job offers. No auditions. His name was still a stain on Hollywood's reputation, a cautionary tale that no one dared touch. And then, as if to twist the knife deeper, an ad popped up on the screen. Jonathan Caldwell's masterclass, The Art of Filmmaking. Ethan stared at the image. Caldwell, seated in a leather chair, his expression calm and authoritative, hands folded, as if he were some wise mentor passing down knowledge. The tagline beneath his name read, "Learn from the best. Build your career under the guidance of a Hollywood legend." Ethan closed the laptop with a sharp snap. He sat there for a long time, hands clenched into fists, heart pounding in his chest. Caldwell had taken everything from him. His career, his future, his dignity. And now he was profiting off of it, selling his so-called wisdom while Ethan rotted in obscurity. For the first time in months, Ethan felt something other than exhaustion, other than numbness. It started as a slow burn in his chest, then spread, coiling around his ribs like fire. Ethan sat in his car, parked at the edge of a cliffside overlooking the city. The skyline glittered in the distance, bright and alive, but he felt nothing. The cup of instant noodles in the passenger seat was untouched, the broth now cold and congealed. He hadn't eaten all day. He hadn't wanted to. Hunger had stopped mattering. Everything had stopped mattering. His phone lay face down on the dashboard, silent. It had been that way for weeks. No calls, no texts, no auditions, no job offers. Just a black mirror reflecting the hollowed-out man he had become. He had spent the past few months clinging to the remnants of a dream that had already died, sleeping in his car, taking whatever work he could find, enduring the whispers, the laughter, the way people looked through him like he was a ghost of someone they had already forgotten. Every night, he told himself that if he could just make it to the next day, something would change. Someone would finally give him a chance. But nothing changed. No one came. He ran a hand over his face, exhaling shakily. His fingers were cold. Everything felt cold. He reached for his phone, turning it over, staring at the screen. He thought about calling someone. Tyler, maybe. An old acting coach. A director who once told him he had promise. But what would he even say? Hey, remember me? The guy from the Caldwell video? The one everyone laughed at? The one Hollywood erased? He imagined the awkward silences, the forced pity, the inevitable excuses. Sorry, man, I wish I could help. It's just complicated. No, he wouldn't do that. Ethan opened the car door and stepped out. The wind hit him like a slap, sharp and biting. He walked to the edge of the overlook, staring down at the jagged rocks below. His heartbeat was steady, too steady. He thought he would be afraid. But there was only exhaustion. His entire life, he had been fighting to be seen, fighting to prove he was worth something, fighting to survive. But what was the point of surviving if every single day was just another reminder that he had already lost? He closed his eyes. Then his phone buzzed. A single vibration, then another, then another. Ethan froze. He hadn't heard that sound in weeks. For a long moment, he just stood there, the wind howling around him. Then, slowly, he turned back toward the car, his steps mechanical. He reached inside, grabbed the phone, and looked at the screen. A name flashed across the notification bar. Alexander Graves. Ethan's brows furrowed. He knew that name. Everyone did. Alexander Graves was one of the most legendary directors in Hollywood. The kind of filmmaker who only made one movie every 5 years. But every single one was a masterpiece. A recluse. A genius. A man who had built careers overnight. The text was short. Call me. I want to talk about an opportunity. Ethan stared at the words, uncomprehending. This had to be a mistake. A joke. Someone messing with him. His fingers trembled as he dialed the number. It rang once, twice. Then a deep, gravelly voice answered. Ethan Cole. Ethan swallowed. His mouth was dry. Yeah. A pause. Then, I just saw your audition tape. Ethan blinked. His mind reeled. What audition tape? Graves continued before he could ask. The one from Caldwell's film. Someone sent it to me. Said you were the guy he rejected. Ethan's stomach twisted. Yeah, that's me. Another pause. You're good, kid. Ethan let out a bitter laugh. I was. Doesn't really matter now, does it? Graves ignored the self-pity. I'm directing a film. A real one. Not some bloated Hollywood cash grab. I need an actor who can carry a role, someone raw, someone hungry. And I think that's you. Ethan's breath hitched. He gripped the phone tighter. This couldn't be real. I saw something in that tape, Graves continued. Something Caldwell was too stupid to recognize. You've got fire, kid. And fire like that doesn't just go out. Ethan closed his eyes, his throat tightening. He wanted to believe this. Wanted to believe that this was real. That Graves saw something in him that wasn't just the broken remnants of a failed career. But how could he? How could he trust after everything? What's the catch? He asked. No catch, Graves said simply. Just one condition. Ethan braced himself. What? Then Graves said, you don't quit. Ethan exhaled, the weight of those words sinking into his bones. He thought about where he had been 5 minutes ago, standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to let go. He thought about Caldwell, about Brandon Hale, about every person who had laughed at him, erased him, told him he wasn't enough. He thought about how he had spent months surviving, but never living. Then, for the first time in a long time, he chose to fight. I'm in, Ethan said. Ethan hadn't stepped onto a film set in nearly 2 years. Not as an actor, anyway. The last time he had been this close to Hollywood's orbit, he had been holding a mop, watching from the sidelines as others lived the life that had once been his dream. Now he stood at the gates of a private soundstage, gripping the strap of his duffel bag so tightly his knuckles turned white. He should have been excited, should have felt relief, gratitude, something other than the suffocating weight pressing down on his chest. Instead, he felt like an imposter. The past week had been a blur. From the moment he had told Alexander Graves he was in, everything had moved at a speed Ethan could barely process. A first-class ticket to New York. A hotel room that wasn't a roach-infested dump. A wardrobe that wasn't secondhand. A contract sent to his email detailing the role he had been given, the lead. Graves hadn't been exaggerating when he said this was a real film. The production was small, independent, but every name attached to it carried weight. The script, a raw and brutal drama about a man clawing his way out of ruin, felt like it had been written for him. Maybe it had. Graves had made it clear. This wasn't just another movie. This was a comeback story. And Ethan was the protagonist. But standing here now, on the first day of filming, staring at the towering soundstage doors, doubt gnawed at him like a parasite. What if I can't do this? What if I'm still the same failure they all laughed at? What if Caldwell was right? The thought was like ice in his veins. He didn't belong here. He didn't deserve this. Then the doors opened and Graves walked out, spotting Ethan immediately. The director was taller than he looked in interviews, his sharp features made more intense by the streaks of gray in his beard. He didn't smile, didn't waste time on pleasantries. He simply nodded. You're late. Ethan glanced at his watch. He was early. Graves turned, motioning for him to follow. Come on. Let's see if you're as good as I think you are. The set was nothing like the massive productions Ethan had once auditioned for. No sprawling trailers, no armies of assistants. It was raw, stripped down to essentials. But there was an energy in the air, the feeling that something real was being made here. Graves led him to a small rehearsal space, where a woman sat flipping through a script. Margot Lane, an Academy Award-winning actress. The kind of performer who could make or break a scene with just a look. She barely acknowledged Ethan as he walked in, only glancing up with mild disinterest before returning to her notes. Graves clapped his hands. We're running the opening scene. No cameras yet. I just want to see what you've got." Ethan's mouth went dry. He hadn't performed in so long. What if it was gone? Margot sighed, finally looking at him properly. "You ready? Or do you need a moment?" The impatience in her voice made something snap inside him. He wasn't about to let her, or Graves, or anyone else doubt him. Not after everything. He exhaled, found his mark, and when he spoke his first line, it happened. The shift. The transformation. The moment he stepped into the character, the fear vanished. His body moved on instinct, every word sharp, every emotion raw. It wasn't just acting. It was survival. When the scene ended, the silence stretched long enough that doubt started creeping back in. Then, Graves let out a low, satisfied chuckle. Margot arched an eyebrow, but said nothing, just gave a small nod before returning to her script. Graves clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "Not bad. Try not to F***ck it up." That was the closest thing to praise Ethan had ever gotten from a director. Filming began the next day. Every morning, Ethan arrived before the crew, rehearsing until his voice was raw. He refused to be anything less than perfect. He had spent 2 years being forgotten. He would not be forgotten again. But the deeper he went into the role, the harder it became to separate himself from the past. The character he played, a man beaten down by life, forced to fight for every scrap of dignity, wasn't fiction. It was his reflection. Every scene forced him to relive the humiliation, the anger, the helplessness of standing in that audition room while Caldwell laughed at him. And Graves saw it. He didn't coddle Ethan, didn't reassure him. He pushed him harder, made him dig deeper, until every moment on screen felt like it was tearing something open inside him. One night, after an especially brutal scene, Ethan sat outside the soundstage, staring at his shaking hands. He had never felt more alive. The final week of filming came faster than he expected. The entire crew could feel it. They were making something special. Graves had directed masterpieces before, but this film was different. It was personal, and Ethan was at the center of it. On the last day of shooting, as the final scene wrapped, the set erupted into applause. Margot approached Ethan, studying him for a long moment before offering a small smile. "You were good," she admitted. "Better than I expected." Graves pulled Ethan aside. "You did your job," he said simply. "Now, let's see if the world pays attention." The film entered post-production. Ethan waited. Then, one morning, his phone buzzed with a single message from Graves. "It's done. And it's going to change everything." Ethan sat in the darkened screening room, his hands clenched together so tightly his knuckles turned white. The credits were rolling, but he hadn't moved. He barely even breathed. His own face had filled the massive screen for the past 2 hours. Every raw emotion, every haunted stare, every moment of rage and desperation. It hadn't felt like watching a movie. It had felt like watching his own soul being laid bare for the world to see. Alexander Graves leaned forward from his seat across the room, the glow of the screen casting sharp shadows across his face. "What do you think?" Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. He had been so afraid that after everything, after all the blood, sweat, and pain, it wouldn't be enough. That the film would be good, but not great. That he would be remembered as decent instead of unforgettable. But this was something else entirely. Ethan exhaled slowly. "It's real." Graves chuckled, leaning back. "Damn right it is." The next morning, the first reviews dropped. A masterpiece. The kind of film that lingers in your bones long after the credits roll. The Hollywood Reporter Ethan Cole delivers one of the most gut-wrenching performances of the decade. A career-defining role, if there's any justice in the world. Variety forget everything you thought you knew about Ethan Cole. This isn't just a comeback. It's a reckoning. IndieWire, the words blurred together as Ethan scrolled through them, his hands shaking. He had spent so long being a ghost, being erased, being a joke. But now they were saying his name again. And this time, it wasn't followed by laughter. Then came the calls. Every studio, every director, every agent who had ignored him, every producer who had turned their back, suddenly wanted a meeting. Everyone who had once told him he wasn't right for the part was now calling him a once-in-a-generation talent. His inbox flooded with scripts. His phone rang so often he had to turn it off just to sleep. He was being invited to galas, to talk shows, to roundtable discussions with actors he had once only dreamed of working with. And then, the Academy announced its nominations. Best Actor, Ethan Cole. He stared at the list, his chest tight. It wasn't just a nomination. It was his name beside legends. It was his name being spoken in the same breath as those he had idolized. His phone rang. Graves. Ethan answered, his voice barely above a whisper. It happened. Graves snorted. Of course it did. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what to say. Then shut up and get ready for the next part. Ethan sat in the back seat of a black SUV as it cruised through the hills toward a private estate in Beverly Hills. His phone buzzed nonstop, notifications lighting up the screen. More interview requests, more congratulations, more proof that the world had finally stopped ignoring him. But he barely glanced at them. His focus was on the article open in front of him. One headline standing out among the sea of praise. Has Hollywood's kingmaker lost his touch? The Fall of Jonathan Caldwell. The article was brutal. It dissected Caldwell's career, pointing out that while his films had dominated award seasons for over a decade, his latest work, a massive budget historical epic meant to cement his legacy, had underperformed. The reviews were lukewarm. Some called it uninspired. Others said it was a desperate attempt to recreate past glory. But the worst part? People weren't talking about the film. They were talking about Ethan. Years ago, Caldwell infamously dismissed Ethan Cole during a high-profile audition. Now, as Cole rises to the top, one has to wonder, did Caldwell make the biggest mistake of his career? Ethan exhaled slowly, staring out the window. The irony was poetic. Caldwell had built his entire career on the idea that he decided who mattered in Hollywood. He had shaped stars, crushed careers, controlled the narrative. But for the first time, he wasn't in control. He was watching someone he had tried to erase not only survive but thrive, and worse, watching the world realize what he had done. The SUV pulled up to the estate, where an exclusive pre-Oscar event was being held. Ethan stepped out, adjusting the cuff of his tuxedo, ignoring the murmurs as people turned to watch him. Just a year ago, no one would have cared that he was here. Now, he was the most talked about person in the room. He had barely been inside for 10 minutes when he felt it, the weight of someone's stare. Jonathan Caldwell stood across the room, a glass of whiskey in hand, watching him with an unreadable expression. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then Caldwell smirked. He made his way over, moving with the same arrogance he always had. But Ethan saw something else beneath it now, something that hadn't been there before. A crack. Ethan Cole, Caldwell said smoothly, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Look at you. Ethan took a sip of his own drink, meeting Caldwell's gaze without flinching. Jonathan. Caldwell chuckled, shaking his head. You know, if someone had told me a few years ago that you'd be standing here, nominated for an Oscar, I would have laughed. Ethan tilted his head slightly. You did laugh. Caldwell's smirk didn't fade, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Annoyance, maybe even regret. I have to admit, you surprised me. But let's be honest, this industry is about longevity. A moment of success doesn't mean anything if you can't hold on to it. Ethan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. That's funny, because last I checked, you were the one people were starting to forget. Caldwell's grip on his glass tightened. Ethan smiled, slow and deliberate. Enjoy the party, Jonathan. Then, without another word, he walked away. The next morning, headlines exploded. The night Jonathan Caldwell realized he's no longer untouchable. Ethan Cole walks away the winner before the Oscars even begin. And then, the night of the Academy Awards arrived. The ceremony was a blur of flashing cameras and whispers as Hollywood's biggest names gathered at the Dolby Theater. Every seat was filled with the elite of the industry. Caldwell sat near the front, his expression composed but stiff. His latest film had secured nominations, but the buzz surrounding it had died down. Everyone cared about Ethan now. Then, the moment came, and the Oscar for Best Actor goes to Ethan Cole. The room erupted into applause. cameras flashing as Ethan rose from his seat. He walked toward the stage with steady steps, but he could feel Caldwell's eyes burning into his back. He took the golden statue, the weight of it solid in his hands. The audience quieted as he stepped up to the microphone. He looked out over the sea of faces, directors, actors, producers. People who had ignored him. People who had written him off. People who had laughed at him. He took a breath. Then he spoke. "I was told once that audiences would never want to see me." He let the words settle, the silence thick. That I wasn't the right fit. That I wasn't enough. He turned the Oscar in his hands, letting the stage lights catch on the gold. "To those people, I just want to say, thank you." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some exchanged glances, knowing exactly who he was referring to. Caldwell's expression remained frozen. "Because if I hadn't been told I didn't belong, I never would have fought to prove that I do." The applause started slow. Then it grew, a tidal wave of sound crashing over the room. Ethan stepped off the stage, the Oscar firm in his grip. And as he walked past Caldwell's row, he didn't even look at him. Caldwell sat there, unmoving, his face pale. The applause roared around him, drowning him out. Caldwell left the Oscars that night without saying a word. No after parties. No media appearances. No celebrations. He walked past flashing cameras and microphones shoved in his face, past whispers and sideways glances, past the world that once hung on his every word, but now barely acknowledged him. For the first time in his career, he was irrelevant. The next morning, the headlines were merciless. The night Hollywood belonged to Ethan Cole. Jonathan Caldwell, a legend fading into obscurity. The media didn't even pretend to care about Caldwell's film anymore. It had lost every major category, overshadowed completely by Ethan's victory. The industry had turned the page, and Caldwell wasn't on it. But the worst was yet to come. Ethan's story had become more than just a redemption arc. Journalists started digging. Articles surfaced, interviews with former colleagues, actors who had once been too afraid to speak out. A pattern emerged. Caldwell had done this before. He had sabotaged careers, blacklisted people he didn't like, crushed aspiring actors who didn't fit his vision. And now, people were willing to talk. Studios began to distance themselves. Projects Caldwell had been attached to quietly removed his name. Investors hesitated. Executives who once fought to be in his good graces stopped returning his calls. Hollywood was a machine, and once it decided you were no longer valuable, it didn't offer second chances. Within months, Caldwell went from being one of the most powerful men in the industry to a liability. His upcoming film, one that had been in pre-production for years, was abruptly shelved. His production company lost funding. The few loyal allies he had left whispered about taking a break from working with him. But Caldwell knew the truth. He was finished. The final blow came a year later. He had spent months trying to secure a directing job, any job, but no one wanted his name on their project. Then, one night, he found himself at a high-end restaurant in downtown LA, meeting with a potential producer, his last hope. He arrived early, nursing a drink at the bar, rehearsing his pitch in his head. Then, the door opened, and the entire room seemed to shift. Ethan Cole had walked in. Caldwell stiffened. Ethan didn't see him. Or, if he did, he didn't care. He was surrounded by powerful people, directors, executives, actors who now treated him like Hollywood royalty. Caldwell had once been the center of these rooms. Now, he was just another forgotten man sitting in the corner. The producer he had been waiting for entered, but instead of heading toward Caldwell's table, he veered toward Ethan. They shook hands, exchanged greetings. Caldwell waited, expecting, hoping, the producer would eventually come over. He never did. Caldwell sat there for nearly an hour, watching as Ethan Cole, the man he had once humiliated, held court in a world that no longer belonged to him. Then, the moment that shattered everything. As Ethan was leaving, he walked past Caldwell's table. He slowed, pausing just for a second. Caldwell looked up, expecting a smirk, a taunt, something. But Ethan only met his gaze briefly, his face unreadable, then turned away, without a word. It wasn't anger. It wasn't gloating. It was indifference. And that was worse than hatred. Caldwell sat there, gripping his drink, staring at the empty space where Ethan had just stood. He had spent years believing he could destroy Ethan Cole, erase him from the industry, reduce him to nothing. But in the end, Ethan was the one who had erased him. 3 years later, a small indie film was released. It was directed by a man named Jonathan Caldwell. No major studio had funded it. No major stars had signed on. No theaters gave it prime showings. It disappeared without a trace. Meanwhile, Ethan Cole was now more than an actor. He was a legend. And Jonathan Caldwell? He had become exactly what he had once condemned Ethan to be: forgotten. The end. If you enjoyed this incredible journey of revenge, redemption, and justice, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. What was your favorite moment in Ethan Cole's rise to glory? Was it his Oscar win? The moment he left Caldwell speechless? Or the final poetic justice of Caldwell being erased from Hollywood? Comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our amazing viewers all over the world. Would you have handled things differently if you were Ethan? Let's talk about it in the comments.